Thanks everybody. It's great to see everybody here all across North America. After a couple of years of COVID, I feel like I haven't really talked to anybody in a long time. So it's great to jump back in. Okay. So yeah, I'm Bryn Davidson, co-owner of Lanefab Design Build. We are based in Vancouver, British Columbia. It's September of 2022, and I want to enlist all of you to join in our little effort to try and turn the equinox into the day that everybody changes their filters. After a decade of building high performance homes for clients, you can spend thousands of hours, scrutinizing an energy model, and then you go to your client's house and they haven't changed the filters in 3 years, and the thing's about to keel over and die. So twice a year, we try to get everybody that we know to change their filters. So anyway, that's my first little plug. So with our company, we started Lanefab in 2009. And for those who are not from Vancouver, the name is branded around this idea of what we call a laneway house, because in 2009, Vancouver made those legal across the city. And that's basically a small little house that you can put at the back of your property next to the alley, or in Vancouver, they call them a laneway. So other people call them accessory dwellings or coach house or whatever. So in the beginning, when we started off, we were quite literally a design build, in that here we are mixing up some concrete by hand to build this very first laneway house in the city of Vancouver back in 2009, 2010. At the time, we really wanted to have a green building system that we could do on every single project, so that we weren't doing 5 code minimum and then 1 green building. We wanted a system we could do on every project. So this first little laneway house had, super insulated walls and triple glazed and all those kind of things that you're familiar with. And we kind of spun that into a standardized system that we started using on all of our projects. At the time, this was new. There was this huge lineup around the block. People were very curious about this new type of dwelling. So from there, we went on to build more than 100 of these things all throughout the city of Vancouver. This is another laneway house, same kind of building systems. Another laneway house, this one was solar and heat pumps and things like that. More with rainwater capture, all sorts of things. Great little fun projects, modestly sized, mostly infill behind existing homes. And in the process of doing this thing that was fairly new, we were able to drum up some decent press over the years. And from there, re-expand back into doing full-size homes, but using the same kind of green building systems that we were doing with the laneway houses. So we went forward, same kind of thing, always trying to tinker and try and push the envelope within our own little world of trying to figure out what to do. And so we did a number of these homes. This one's a wheelchair accessible home throughout Vancouver. And after several years of doing this, we started hearing about this thing called passive house. And in the beginning, like everybody, you're like, well, passive solar, passive house, what is that? We started playing around with the PHPP a little bit and started sort of tinkering with this to kind of see where that would go in terms of integrating that with our current sort of system that we'd been building up on our own. We brought that into ideas like this is a renovation addition to an Arthur Erickson house in North Vancouver. But eventually we decided to really make a wholesale shift from this kind of weird mishmash of things that we've been making up on our own, just making shit up, into the much more rigorous and structured world of passive house. And you discover that there's all these other great people around the world working with the same system. And there's a lot of great, because of that, there are a lot of ideas that you can share and build off of. You can constantly, this community is constantly building off of each other to push things forward, as opposed to other green building sort of systems where everybody's just sort of tinkering, trying this and that and whatever. So it has been a great sort of introduction and a way to sort of change what we do, but also meet a lot of good folks. So yeah, over time, eventually we started down the path of certifying passive houses to the international standard, mostly in Vancouver. And I'll say mostly in Vancouver because one of the compelling reasons we've been able to do this and make it standard for all of our projects is because of the collaboration we've had with the City of Vancouver green building staff and the kind of programs they've put in place at the city level. First, to remove barriers, and then to actually provide incentives, whether those are cash incentives or zoning incentives, that make it just that much easier to kind of take a client who's never heard of Passive House and have them say, oh yeah, let's just do it. And so that's what we've been doing for the last, I don't know, 7 or 8 years or whatever it's been. This is the East 37th Passive House, a 33-foot lot, a house with a secondary suite in the basement, facing south. We always had a strong interest in kind of mid-century modern and kind of West Coast modern and some of the LA case study houses, but those LA case study houses are pretty terrible from a thermal envelope point of view. So, we're always trying to bring together a lot of these ideas of indoor, outdoor, and transparency and modernism and blend it with the science of Passive House. This is a Passive House with a basement suite and a laneway house together. This was pretty modest by Vancouver cost standards, cheaper than a lot of the code minimum houses getting built in Vancouver. We built the first certified Passive House in New Westminster. This is a 1-story. The first certified Passive House in Burnaby. This is just a single family house. It's an east-west lot, so we're aiming to actually capture sun from the side, and so the massing of this house and the overhangs and everything kind of unfold directly from those kind of Passive House ideas. This is a pair of Passive Houses that we built in Vancouver. Each of these has a secondary suite and then also a laneway house at the back. So these are 2 lots together, and we ended up with 3 dwellings where 2 little old bungalows had sat before. Same ideas in terms of building envelope and shading and everything else, but in a sort of more sort of quasi-traditional sort of package compared to some of what we've been doing. At the other end of the sort of aesthetic spectrum, we had a client really wanted something boxy and modern. This is, again, another Passive House with a basement suite and a laneway house, so 3 dwellings on a single lot. On a very difficult east-west site, you can see that house to the left. They actually have this illegal sort of addition on the top of their roof, and I think that was killing about a full kilowatt, I think, off of our annual heat demand. And so we were really struggling with, how do you make Passive House work in these kind of difficult urban situations? It's definitely not the house on the hill that you see where it's sort of perfectly oriented to capture whatever sun you want. In more recent years in British Columbia, they've adopted what they call the step code. So they have a step code 1 to 5, and step code 5 is sort of roughly equivalent to Passive House at a broad brush level. And this is a really great system because it gives municipalities a roadmap of kind of where they can go. It also gives builders a roadmap of where you're going to be going as the building code becomes more stringent going forward with each coming year. So some builders are like, crap, we've got to now build to step code 3. Other folks say, well, let's just jump to step code 5 or Passive House because that's the finish line. Once we figure out how to do that, then we can coast because that's where we need to be. So I think this sort of roadmap, the step code system has been great. So this is in North Vancouver. This is a step code 5 house. A lot of all the same kind of systems and products that we were putting into a Passive House, but just going through a different kind of certification. This is a Passive House on a skinny 25-foot lot with I guess we'll call it a so-called garage. The City of Vancouver required a single parking space. It's probably the only garage with a trifold triple glazed Passive House folding door as part of the building envelope. So you know, these urban sites are definitely a challenge, and working with the zoning constraints is a challenge, but it is interesting, and we can generally have a system now that we can take and apply it to just about any property, and more or less make it work. I was sort of also throwing in this picture because one of the things that we've been wrestling a lot with, like everybody, compared to when we started, is this issue of overheating. And I know when we first started building in Vancouver, we never even thought about it. You just open the windows at night and the house cools down and it's all great. But now with the shifting climate and these extreme heat events, we can't be that lazy anymore. So this one picture, we've got the fixed shading, the overhangs on the south side. We've got the active shading, which is this sort of mechanical awning that extends to cover that upper floor patio. And then we also have active cooling in the form of an air source heat pump that's serving this. And so that's a package of things that we're putting on almost all of our projects now. But I think it is important to recognize that only 2 of those also work during a power outage. So, you know, whether you're in Texas or California or wherever, going forward, our extreme heat events are going to be increasingly coupled with grid problems. And so I think we all know how well Passive House does in the winter if there's a power outage. But I think we also need to wrestle with in the summer how we deal with our shading strategies. And I know in our office, we've gotten to be much more sensitive to that in a way we weren't 5 years ago. So I alluded a little bit to some of the rules in terms of how we make Passive House scalable, because for us, we find only maybe a third of our clients walk in the door knowing what Passive House is. And then maybe the other third are interested when we tell them. And the last third really don't give a damn. You know, they come to us because they like the design and they like the general approach. And so if we can just do Passive House in a way that's cost competitive or compelling in terms of its benefits, then they just go along with that. So that's always been our goal, is to make it so that we can do this on every single project without question, so that we're not going through this kind of awful ROI conversation of how much does this cost versus payback period and blah, blah, blah. I hate that conversation, because it's really mostly a way that people are just masking their discomfort with doing something unusual. And once you've done a number of these things and shown that it's not weird, they're generally okay with that. But a big part of what helps is if your local city is on board with supporting this initiative. So what I've got here is an example of 4 different scenarios of a 33-foot lot in Vancouver. And on the far right, we can see we call FSRs the same as FAR. It's a measure of density. But basically, we're getting a density bonus now if we build either to the certified Passive House or the certified net zero standard. And so this becomes a really compelling feature for that last third of folks who really don't care about Passive House. They don't care about climate. They don't care about any of that stuff. They want a nice house. They want it to cost competitive. And if you can get bonus square footage, that can really sell it. So on our typical property in Vancouver, 33-foot lot, these are the different sizes that you can get. With the Passive House, the certified project, we're getting about an 18 to 20% bump. So that's an extra 600 square feet, which is enough space for some extra, revenue suites or whatever. If you look in Vancouver at a market value of $1,000 a square foot, as a rule of thumb, that's about $600,000 of value that comes from upgrading to Passive House. And the cost to upgrade is maybe 80 grand or something like that. So it becomes a bit of a no-brainer, for at least for us, for people that are familiar with this type of system. And so everybody coming in the door, we can say, let's go do this. What has been interesting in the last year or two, though, is that the incentive that they're offering is being offered either for Passive House or certified net zero. And so we've started jumping into this interesting conversation that building nerds are really into: passive house versus net zero, blah, blah, blah. And I would say, after now cranking through a number of these projects, we're seeing that the net zero, it is an easier and lazier path. I don't really have to be that rigorous with my concept design. I can kind of do and design almost anything, and make it work. The big thing for a lot of these is that net zero we can do with a slightly thinner wall, which means out of our given floor area, we get a little bit of extra usable floor area. Now, at the end of the day, is it a better building? I don't think so. I think net zero has a problem in that it has a heavily kind of what I would call a suburban bias, in that if you do a really spread out rancher house with a big roof, it's quite easy to do net zero. You can do a really crappy building and throw enough solar on it and call it net zero. It's not like passive house where it's actually a guarantee of doing a quality building. But when we go into an urban setting where we are doing higher density, multiple units with small roofs, net zero becomes a real challenge. And so you see the ways that, passive house plus is much better adapted for kind of urban sort of building typologies versus net zero, where we end up doing these solar carports or whatever, because we just frankly don't have enough roof space for all the solar that you need. Then, there's also issues like, okay, in BC, we have clean energy. Should we be incentivizing solar? All these sort of debates back and forth, and they're worthy debates, but at the end of the day, they're not necessarily the most interesting thing to me. I want to look at a project from the big picture level and say, is our project making a difference in the fight against climate change, in addition to being beautiful and being a good home for people? So this is where, for the last, Sean was talking about the TEDx talk that I did back in 2014, which laid out our kind of roadmap for how we wanted to push beyond passive house, beyond harm reduction, to having projects that actually had a measurably positive impact on the climate. And this is not an easy thing to do, but in short, if we can get to net positive, then every project we do is actually beneficial. And what we found is, doing these kind of infill projects where we were actually replacing old, fossil fuel burning homes with higher density homes that were efficient, zero carbon. We provided a place where people could actually drive less versus living in the suburbs. You put all these things together and you could actually have your project create a net reduction in CO2 on the planet, which is kind of the goal that we're aiming for. So to kind of sum that up in kind of the short version, I would generally say that if you've got two passive house projects and one of them is a renovation or it's an infill building, if it's walkable, it's going to have a better impact at a holistic level than a certified passive house that's on a green field or one that's in a rural location. There's nothing wrong with building those. Those can be fantastic projects as well. But in terms of their collective impact, if we look at systems and what we should be scaling up, there is a huge difference between those two types. And so it's been great to see over the last 5 or 6 years, there's been this big shift away from these early adopter projects, on the house on the hill, to these urban projects, large multifamily projects. And I think that that's really important. There's the other piece. Sometimes in Vancouver, we will see a certified passive house, and we're very excited about this. But then you look at the section drawing, and it's got like 5 floors of underground parking or something like that. And I'm like, oh my God, this is what I've come to call the kind of iceberg, the carbon iceberg, in that the majority of the impact of that project is hidden below where you don't see it. So when we look at these projects, another thing I've started to look at as we all talk more about embodied carbon, is not just the materials, but also the choices that unfold from things like minimum parking requirements and zoning stuff. So to the extent that we can be building really great low carbon passive house projects with minimal UCS underground car stuff, I think that that's really the way to go. And we need our city planners on board in terms of helping with that. Of course, materials. I think when I did the talk in 2014, I didn't even talk about embodied carbon at all. Like many of us, it was sort of a third order issue, and I think it's really come much more to the fore. And I think it's quite clear that if we're looking for a holistic impact, some of these things, especially crop residues like straw, really have an ability to do some pretty amazing things. And so I say crop residue just because it is, in my mind, better than the one that gets more hyped, which is mass timber. Mass timber is way better than concrete and steel, but it's not some kind of magical, get out of jail free card like some architects talk about it. I think something like 13% of that tree that gets cut down actually ends up being used in the building. So don't quote me on the exact number, but basically, it's not like your mass timber house is magically better for the climate than a forest. So I just want to say that, there are some really interesting things happening with crop residues, with much more sort of urban projects like this. This is 8 floors of straw bale in France. This is not your hippie straw bale project. As much as those things can be fun, they're not scalable. So these types of things are where I start to get excited. So then, oh, sorry here. Oh, there we go. Thinking about what the next decade holds. For us, we started building laneway houses, then single family. Now we're doing duplexes, passive house, net zero, all this kind of stuff. Going forward, there's the kind of 3 things that are sort of twigging my interest at the moment. And we talked a little bit about some of these low carbon materials, but the other 2 is really talking about zoning and some of these code issues, because that's where we take all of our individual projects and we try and figure out how to collectively scale those up so that they aren't just sort of these glorious one-offs, but something that becomes the standard practice for everybody going forward. So when I look at this, the things I'm excited about are scalable infill zoning and point access blocks. I love this chart. You guys can see this is ADUs, accessory dwelling units, permits issued in Los Angeles. And basically, they were struggling. And then all of a sudden, there was this massive jump. And what happened is that they, in 2017, passed a statewide law overriding local municipalities and forcing them to allow accessory dwellings. And it just shows that how much that housing demand is just being held back by really restrictive zoning rules that are micromanaged at the municipal level. And, I've gone around and talked to cities all over North America about accessory dwellings. And believe me, I am fed up having that same conversation 100 times over. What we really need to be doing is changing our zoning at the state and provincial level so that the things that we need to build that are good for housing, good for climate, can happen and can happen at scale. So if anybody's fired up about this, that's where I want to put my energy. City by city, not so much. Another thing that's sort of interesting just in the last couple of years is this idea of point access blocks, which is something that's incredibly common in Europe and other places outside of North America. But it's basically a type of multifamily housing where your units are wrapped around a single stair core. And that's in contrast to the typical North American approach, which requires 2 egress stairs. And because you have 2 egress stairs, you have a connecting corridor. And because you have a connecting corridor, you have these double loaded units. And the buildings have very big footprints and no cross ventilation and all these other kind of problems. And so it's a really interesting thing in terms of how our urban form really is unfolding from this sort of simple requirement around egress. And so there are a lot of municipalities at the moment that are starting to look at how we could maybe change that, because from a climate point of view, if we want to build these sort of ultra low carbon cities of the future, there are great examples of how we can build this sort of 3 to 8 stories. Only about 50% site coverage, so we've got a lot of green space and permeability. Much lower site coverage than a typical North American multifamily project, especially if you don't have an underground parkade. And so I think when you put all these things together, you have this kind of toolkit for how we start to envision the sort of evolution of our cities going forward. So my goal, at least over the next decade, is to try and figure out how to bring all of these things together along with the passive house learning and the low embodied materials, all that kind of stuff. We've been doing prototypes to try and figure out how these sort of small scale multiplexes can be brought into all of our neighborhoods in Vancouver, so that it's not just shoving multifamily housing onto the polluted arterials where it's busy and noisy and polluted, but saying that these are the true green buildings that should be part of every neighborhood in every city. And so we've been trying to figure out this kind of incremental approach that's passive, doesn't rely on underground parking, can be much more accessible, all these kind of things. We've been looking at different scenarios with or without side yard, blah, 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 lots of different details. But I think we've got an election coming up in a month, and we're going to see at that whether this is something that the city, kind of wants to grab onto. But I think either way, just like we have a step code that shows you where the building code is going, with our zoning, we have a roadmap of where our zoning needs to go. And so we hope that what Vancouver is doing can once again be seen as a kind of roadmap for other cities. We did this little mock-up for one of the local political parties. This is one of the richest mansion districts in Vancouver, and we dropped a bunch of passive house plexes on it just to kind of poke at the system a little bit. So we enjoy doing this kind of thing. This is also, one of the expensive neighborhoods in the west side of Vancouver, where we're looking at how these kind of incremental approaches to densification can kind of slide in there amidst everything else. So I am going to leave it there, but I am excited about what the next decade holds, and I'm excited that so many people are all wrestling with the same challenges. So thanks a lot.
All right. So Bryn, we got a queue lined up here. And so before we just do that, I know we got Mr. A. Conrad. We'll jump in a second with his question, but let's just unmute and give you a big round of applause because you're a leader and we love what you do. So. Okay. Thank everyone for doing that. Mute yourselves so we don't get any weird background noises, and we can fire some questions at Bryn and some, other quotes. So Conrad.
I can repeat the question.
Yeah, go for it.
The question was talking about the step code. I was quite excited to hear that step code 5 would be passive house equivalent. But then I heard some news this spring that it was watered down, that there was some sort of a change, and that actually that stringent requirement is no longer required.
Yeah, it has gotten watered down, and honestly, somebody else could probably give you better all the details. My understanding is they've gone from more of a kind of absolute standard to more of a wishy-washy reference standard, a bit like LEED. So that definitely is not great. My hope is that can be firmed up again going forward. I think the main thing is getting the structure for the step code in place and getting the municipalities on board, getting the builders to understand that this is the kind of roadmap. At the moment, it's a relatively small number of folks that are doing step 5, but I do hope they make it more rigorous again.
Thank you.
All right, moving along, Mr. Harvey. Thank you for not posing your famous question. Maybe we hold off that one to the after hours, but you had 2, pick one, only one. Fire away.
Well, they were both answered. So my third one was the one that I really wanted to discuss, but I'll defer because he talked about carbon. I wanted to know what the next steps for his firm, but maybe, I'll go into my last question. It's simple. Bryn, if you had to go back and look at your earlier projects, what would you do if you had to go back and the owner said, hey, we want to remodel, we want to do something? what would be your changes to some of your earlier projects that you've learned over the period of the last few years, etc.?
Cooling. Right now we're retrofitting one of our first passive house projects for a mini split. We found, it had a roof deck, and in most of the time it really does natural draft at night, does it perfectly. But all of a sudden, once it's 80 or 85 degrees at night, that natural cooling just doesn't work anymore. And so we are finding that we are going back and putting some active cooling into some of these things. I think also sort of more active shading in general. Sometimes we're hamstrung by the city because they've only recently made it easier to do appropriate shading, which is kind of ridiculous, but I'd say that's a big piece of it.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Sean.
All right, well, thanks, Harvey. That kind of leads into the next question that Craig, who left because it was only 1:46 in France, and he'd been up all day with the Passive House Canada's prefab symposium. So Craig, we'll let you go to sleep, but he was loving today. So his kind of question was a bit of a deep dive into shading and kind of, he was kind of talking about how to get kids influenced in shading in buildings. But maybe I'll kind of rephrase this question. Just at what point did you get inspired or think that shading was a big portion of design? And again, you show the great details on that particular project, and I've seen it on many others, but when did you kind of realize like cooling and shading had to kind of be involved more in your designs?
Well, I mean, the heat dome that we had 2 summers ago really brought that home, but it is an issue that we've been wrestling with. Even some of our early kind of net zero laneway house projects, we had some that struggled with some overheating, again, because the city only allowed a certain size overhang, which was frustrating. In general, when I'm designing things and using PHPP, I'll try and do an optimized overhang where at the winter solstice, the sun comes right to the top of my glazing unit. And then I try to have full shading until September 1st, just as a kind of rule of thumb. And that gives me a certain size window with a certain size overhang. And with a patio door, maybe it's a 5 or 6 foot overhang. But there's a kind of general approach there that I've found has worked pretty well. And then now, yeah, we've used mini splits. We've done a number of not certified passive houses with the Minotaur, which is an HRV with a heat pump built into it. Works really great on laneway houses and some of these other units. So we're constantly tinkering as well, and always interested in what other people are trying.
My comment or question was, what software do you use when you're looking at, that lovely sun that goes over our lovely planet and over Vancouver?
So we do our concept work in SketchUp. So I'll just model the shading right in SketchUp. And then we use a plugin for SketchUp called Design PH if we're doing a passive house project. And so we'll kind of get the project, sort of halfway there, and then we'll start modeling it in Design PH and going through multiple iterations, because we always want to try and see how close we can get to that target, just using the form and massing, so that we're not trying to rely on things like window specs or HRV specs to get us there. And we find if we can usually get Design PH to 15 to 18 kilowatt hours or whatever, we can usually make it work. But it's a pretty good tool along with SketchUp for looking at the shading and the demand together.
Awesome. Okay. Jeff, I didn't forget you. You're next. Mr. Jeffrey Rodine, coming from East Coast. Fire away.
I think this is fabulous, because you're giving us a whole set of design guidelines that I think everybody are invaluable. My question is that I think like Vancouver and Boston, usable square footage or rentable square footage is like premium because it's $1,000. So what do you find the differences between the net zero and the passive house design in terms of how much of a penalty do you pay in passive house for the reduction in rentable square footage? I mean, it's like it is a percentage. I would think that as the building got bigger, the percentage would go down.
Yeah, so I mean, our standard passive house wall is a 17-inch assembly. That's from drywall to outside of cladding. And our standard step 4 laneway house or net zero wall is a 13-inch. So you've got a handful of inches there that you're reducing and going from passive house to net zero. And if you take that, you know, 4 or whatever inches all the way around on all 3 floors, it can add up to, you know, 150, 200 square feet, you know, which is not nothing. And especially if you have a tight site with side-by-side units, those couple of inches can start to make a little bit of a difference in your layouts. So I think there is a perception in the local market that net zero is an easier or more sellable way to get to this bulk floor area bonus that they are giving us. I don't know that I necessarily agree that it should be that way, but you know, that's the kind of raw logistics of it.
No, that's very interesting. Thank you very much. That's it. I mean, I've got a million other questions, but I didn't ask them. So.
Yep. You hold it. You get one. Get back in the queue. We'll come back to you. Hold on. We have next. We get Gwill.
Hi. Actually, I think it was partly answered by Jeff's question, actually. But forgive my ignorance. But Bryn, for the again, that difference between the 14 and 17 inch on the walls for the net zero versus passive house. On our multis, we get to use that, the wall thickness exclusion portion of the bylaw as well. And then we get the 1% for the bigger buildings in addition to that to take off. Again, forgive my ignorance, does that portion apply to the single family realm of things in terms of zoning, or is that not covered by it?
It used to. So actually that first laneway house that I showed you at the very beginning, it had 13-inch thick walls and the whole house was only 700 square feet. And so we were looking at that thick wall was taking up a huge portion of our usable square footage. And so we went to the city planners and we said, hey guys, your system of counting square footage is really penalizing green building. And so on that project, we got them to give us the first, what we call thick wall exclusion in the city. And eventually, several years later, they kind of formalized that into this sort of calculation where you could, they'd kind of let you, you know, do this calculation and not count the stuff beyond code minimum. And then they eventually changed that again and again. And then finally, a couple of years ago, they said, hey, this is getting way too complicated for houses. We're just going to give you a block incentive. So instead of doing all these complicated calculations, they're like, here's, if you're certified, you get to exclude 18% of your floor area. And that was great because it made it a lot simpler, but it also gave us about 10 to 15% net usable floor area as an incentive. So they finally switched from sort of harm reduction, from removing barriers to actually incentivizing. So that was a big step. And we haven't seen that yet in multifamily, but that's what we're doing with 1 and 2 family.
Yeah, we've been, dare I say, for all the great work the city of Vancouver's done, we are constantly complaining about the excessive complexity of wall thickness exclusions, and just especially when you've got multis with big buildings, lots of area calculations going on, and having to just constantly adjust these things. And again, during the process, you may well end up changing your wall assembly ever so slightly, whether it's by cladding or it's the insulation type or something. And all of a sudden, you're going to go back and rerun your numbers all again. And it's ridiculous minutiae that makes such little impact on the building. And we just keep saying, let us measure to the face of the drywall, and then we're done. Just let us then put
exactly.
a big thick
the
wall
whole
on.
Calculation thing is ridiculous. And now, I mean, the city, their next step is they are going to start putting in place regulations and incentives for embodied carbon, which is quite interesting. So we might start to see some cash incentives for doing lower embodied carbon in some of these things. But those calculated methods are a problem, because if you just did solid 2-pound spray foam, again, you'd save 3 or 4 inches off of, say, blown cellulose, which translates into a lot of sellable floor area. So there's some perverse incentives based off of those methodologies. So
Absolutely.
Anyway, it's been a constant conversation for the last 13 years with them.
Yeah, great work, by the way. Thanks very much.
Love it when you have like 2 powerhouses of Vancouver passive house movement, having a chat. So, Gwill's talking about a project where it's one passive house project, and it's 5 buildings on the development, and he has every single wall you could ever imagine. So thanks, Gwill. So I get to play multiple hats today. I had to get to play host, question concierge, and then the regular stuff. And so I get to wrap up this evening, and then we'll dive into the after hour. We're already a minute over. So Bryn, hopefully you can stick around as late as you can. I believe your child got picked up from daycare, and so hopefully that will continue. And we thank you for all the support in doing that. I'm glad that you've got refreshments. And a few notes that I just want to go over is it's really exciting that when we do our bike tour along the unofficial Passable Street of Dreams in Vancouver, we do get to showcase that project on East 37. So thank you for finding the client to make sure that it's a pin in, it's right in the middle. When we do the north and the south, we always get to showcase yours. And if you were hanging out with Passives Canada and the Prefab Symposium today, again, that particular project did use some prefab components. You did use SIP panels, so great effort in not only in that project and other projects where you've played around with prefab. Again, I appreciate the fact you made big risks for your projects, and you're continuously trying to make the passive house movement affordable and having great conversations with your clients. And if you're not following Bryn in Twitter, oh boy, he literally can give Lloyd Alter a news article every day with his slide decks, his presentations, his posts. And if you didn't see, could you, and if you're not from Vancouver, if you could imagine putting those projects in Shaughnessy, oh my God, you would start a revolution. And great to see that the markers are there on the map, and maybe one day we'll get some of Bryn's projects in a very luxurious part of Vancouver that deserves them and needs them. So I hope that that happens. Something new I learned today, keyword, crop residue. Again, probably a new article for Lloyd for tomorrow. Great info. And I know we've got a couple of questions. And I think it was interesting too of if within our movements, how maybe Chris Magwood inspired you about the low embodied carbon materials. I know he inspired me probably at the same time you were diving into it. So great stuff today. And I already teased Zach and Kim, but maybe we need Mike Eliason to come back and talk more about large slabs and stuff that he's doing, because I see that he influenced you, influenced City of Vancouver, and influenced myself. So hopefully everyone enjoyed Bryn's discussion today. Your homework, because we always give you homework. Next week, you got to bring a friend. And you know we spell friend with PH, but the extra special homework you have tonight is Bryn. If you saw the number there, he's almost at 183,000 views on his TED Talk YouTube page. Go read it, go check it out, share with your friends so he can maybe get to 184 pretty quick. I think that's more than even the Passos podcast. So Bryn, I mean, you're an influencer all by yourself. I mean, we have to get speakers every week to do the podcast, and you're already doing it. So great YouTube link. I know Kim put it in the chat. It's up there in there. So save the chat. Whew. We are done the first hour, folks. Let's dive back into questions in the overtime. And in that queue, we have, Will wrapped it up. We had Harvey. Harvey, hold on, we'll come back to you in a second. I'm going to give Peter Molnaire an opportunity to speak. And we've, again, before you hop on there, Peter, I have to give a huge thanks to Kim, because her and I used to do the question concierge service all by myself. Kim's on board, and she is making my life a lot easier. So thank you, Kim. And the fact that she has our new passive house enthusiasts that it hopefully is sleeping and being a part of the whole evening. So thanks, Kim, and thanks to your family for making my life so easy. So Peter, where are you?
Right here. Yes, thank you. The question is brief. I like the terminology crop residue fiber. Is hemp in that class? Can it be used as a crop residue fiber?
Probably. Honestly, I'm not an expert. A lot of this stuff I'm picking up from Michael Burkert in Germany and some of these other folks that are doing really, interesting work. It's something that I always want to try and bring into my work, but I am not, Joe low embodied carbon. I know there are folks here who are creating new North American products. I've always lamented the fact that BC produced all this wood fiber and we didn't produce any decent wood fiber products. We just import all this stuff from Germany, which is silly. And I just really want to figure out how to make this stuff work on sort of modern high-rise buildings, how to make it work affordably and competitively, all those things. So as that stuff comes up, I'm going to keep trying to use it. But I know we're working with some UBC students who are building a project out on the campus, and we were doing some experiment with hempcrete with them. Seems like a cool product, but we were just buying bags of like animal bedding hemp, because it's just still a niche product. So all this stuff has to get scaled up.
Great question there, Peter. Anything else? Are you good? No. Well, again, just a shout out to Edith, who's joining us from Timber HP. So again, wood fiber manufacturing is in process here in North America. They're doing a great job, and exciting too is there is some grants happening out here on the East Coast. I've applied for them, so there's definitely a lot of efforts on getting wood fiber manufacturing here on the West Coast. And I'll just plant the seed here because sometimes you got to say it to manifest it. Is there's a beautiful pulp mill in Powell River that is now deceased, but it's got all the right parts. So all of us together, talk to somebody. We're making it work. So just saying. Anyhow, Edith, I'll talk to Scott. Okay, moving along in the queue. Talking about mass timber, Mr. Jeff Spiritos, your question, maybe a comment. Always, I know it's good talking to you. So Jeff, turn over to you.
Hey, thanks, Sean. Good seeing you. Good seeing Zach and Mark and the whole gang here. Bryn, nice going with that presentation for sure. Just want to have us all look to getting as much data as we can about forest products that are used in mass timber. There's a constant effort to increase the amount of the tree that is used, whether it's, in mass timber or dimensional lumber or other byproducts that have a market and can be an alternative to carbon producing approaches. That's a given for folks in the industry. And I just want to make the point, as I made in the comment, that, with steel and concrete still trying to figure out how to decarbonize in a meaningful way, and realizing that we're in a movement where more and more people are going to be moving into cities and densifying, and that being an approach to environmental progress. Really, you want to be building with mass timber as much as you can, because otherwise you've got steel and concrete that are the solutions. So, we're all in this thing together. I'm glad that we're, all discussing this on the accelerator, and look, forward to hearing other points of view, and, and conversing about it, and us all learning together.
No, great point, Jeff. And Bryn, I mean, I know there's some really cool homes in Vancouver that have used NLT, so nail laminated timber, for some really cool floor decks. And Bryn, maybe just a final comment about, your view and trying to figure out how to work with mass timber.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think it's all great. I mean, we have dowel laminated timber, which even gets rid of the steel, and there's all these cool things. I mean, we've got a number of mass timber innovators in BC, and so I'm all for all of those things. I just think as we start figuring out, in the green building world, we are trying to create a set of ideas that the mass market can pick up and run with. And so we do all these interesting things, and then eventually we have to figure out how those scale up. And so I think we run into these questions like, okay, should we just be doing stick frame up to 6 stories? And then do mass timber beyond and replace all the concrete. I don't know. I think it's an ongoing conversation. I'm a little cautious when I see some architects, not all, but some, talk about mass timber as this kind of big credit that they're getting in terms of carbon sequestration. And I always feel a little weird about that. But I think that all of the individual projects that are happening are fantastic, and I'm excited to see it.
So Jeff, if you're worried that he was a skeptic, he's diehard like you and I, my friend. And
Yeah,
we're lucky here in Vancouver, where again, we got Structure Craft, we have Structureland nearby, we have Klisnikov. And so we're blessed with some really cool mass timber operations. And sometimes we just have NLT that gets, manufactured in someone's backyard. So it's pretty cool to see. And you know what, again, Jeff, just to give you kudos, for all those that are out there that I haven't met in person, I really look forward to getting to more conferences to see you. So hopefully if you're in around the Chicago network, you'll come to FIASCon. It was great to go to the International Mass Timber Conference that was connected by the Forest Business Network. And I got to meet Jeff in person because again, we're great in 2D. Boy, we're also great in 3D. So, I'm really lucky that I get to see Bryn and I see Matt Turner, Bryn's business partner, on board here tonight. They're doing some great stuff here in Vancouver. And again, I'm glad that this community has this platform. And but again, it's nice to share a Wobbly Pop with you all in person. So I look forward to those opportunities. So moving along in the question queue, let me check. Mr. Harvey, you're back up. Are you still with us, or did you jump off? Well, if he jumped off, Bryn, you escaped the die-hard Passive House Accelerator live question of what does your buildings cost? So we won't ask that question. Victor, if you're still with us, Victor, sorry, I gotta see if Victor is still with us. Victor actually had a good question, so I will find it. Victor. So the house that has a retractable awning also has a canopy, and I'm curious, how is it built to mitigate thermal bridging? Great question, and I know you got a great detail to showcase, so I'll let you speak about that.
Yeah, so over the years we've tried all sorts of different systems. We've used SIP panels, we've done stick frame, we've done exterior mineral wool, I've done I don't know, all sorts of different things. They all have slightly different strategies. In this case, that project, I believe, was a double stud. So the outer wall was actually a structural wall. One of the advantages of that system, the disadvantage is it doesn't keep your sheathing as warm as having all that rock salt. The advantage is you can hang basically anything you want on the outside, and it doesn't really matter. The other advantage is you can use the concrete as an architectural element at the ground level because it's exposed. So in that case, we just have steel outriggers bolted right onto the structural wall, and then we have a thermal break insulation, everything happening inside of that.
So yeah, Victor, if you again not with us, Bryn is all about the details and making sure that we got the thermal breaks on the thermal bridges. And definitely knows the numbers to add that to his PHP model. So, I'm sure, Bryn, we could just have on, and Mark's not really listening, so I'm going to pin on him because he's doing too many things at the same time. We could have just a construction tech event on that detail alone. So maybe we'll pull you back one day into that type of showcase, because I know some of the details you do are really, really good. So, we'll see if we can get you back in the next little bit here. All right, Tom Phillips had a couple questions, and I appreciate Tom Phillips. He is from Healthy Building Research in Davis, California. Tom, you still with us?
Yeah.
There you go.
See everybody.
Great to see you.
And hopefully I'll be able to catch up with you some more. I have the standard question: how resilient and healthy is your building? And I love your presentation, Bryn, and your leadership on passive house and shading and now overheating and so on. So more specifically, how did you assess overheating risk in terms of, was it the BC step code method or passive house or all of the above? And did you look at power outages? And a kind of a related question is then, how do you verify the performance of the building in terms of overheating and cooling load and stuff like that? Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. We're a pretty small operation, so we don't have quite the same data analytics that maybe a big company does. Usually, if the clients are complaining or some other issue, that's how we're finding out about things. I think one of the interesting things is that once you start selling passive house to people who don't care about passive houses, you discover some interesting things about how they actually use the building. You know, maybe they always want it to be 24 degrees Celsius nonstop, and they leave the windows open, or they don't change their filters or whatever. You find that there are some limits between what PHPP models versus what your crazy clients do. And so we have started building in probably a bit more padding into some of these things than you might have otherwise. And you know, that goes into cooling as well. Same thing if you have a 3-story house, where, you know, PHPP is giving you this kind of very rudimentary overheating metric, but there's a big spread between what's happening in your basement suite versus what's happening in your 3rd floor west facing bedroom. And so we've found that while, you know, overall capacity issues might be fine, there are some distribution issues in terms of where that cooling is going. The question of whether we should be doing a ducted mini split versus a single head or 2 head. Where is the thermostat for that? Is it on the main floor or the upper floor? Like all these little kind of things. You know, under normal operating conditions, we're used to a passive house being very even and kind of, you know, but they're in an overheating situation, we do end up with these discrepancies between different parts of the house. And we've had to become a little bit more sophisticated, and usually because there's problems that we had to go back and kind of try to address.
Great. So there's no requirement specifically then, I guess, under BC step code or anything yet? Is it voluntary?
If you're doing full-size projects like big multifamily stuff and rezonings, I think the city of Vancouver is now asking for, I believe it's a room by room or some kind of similar overheating analysis. Will can probably comment more than I can, because we don't necessarily see that requirement in the single family world.
Okay, thanks.
No, great questions there, Tom. Okay, well, sorry, I got to pause for a second. So, Bernard, what occasion are you up to that you have pulled out the tuxedo? I mean, this is, you know, we have seen many firsts in a long time here, but this is the first where we had a tuxedo show up. I mean, Mark pulled out his classic green jacket, but Bernard, what's going on that you got all dolled up for? Give us what's going on? Are you at an event that you pulled off to just say hello?
So thank you very much indeed, and it's way past midnight here. It's been a very, very sad and difficult week for us. We just said goodbye to our late Queen. And although that state ceremonial that many of you may have seen was spectacular, it's still quite hard to absorb the fact that our Queen has died after her 70-year reign. But it's happened, and we now have King Charles III, and we have a new age. The Elizabethan age has given way to the Carolingian age. This evening, I hosted a dinner at White's. Now, White's is the oldest gentlemen's club in London. It is the last surviving 17th century club. It was founded in 1693, the year before the Bank of England. And some of the founding members of White's would have known Shakespeare. So I'm very privileged that I was elected to this club 31 years ago. And you know, it is a great privilege to be a member of it. Right now, I'm in my military club. I'm in the Cavalier Guards Club. So if anybody from the passive house community ever wants to visit me in London, I can give you somewhere to stay. And if you're a gentleman, I can invite you to White's. And if you're a lady or a gentleman, I can invite you to the Cavalier Guards Club. So that's where I've been. And thank you very much indeed for asking.
Well, you know what, Bernard, I thank you for staying up so late. And again, to the Queen, to the King, to people that are leaders, we thank you for joining us tonight, and all the respect. And I appreciate that you created another frat room for all of us. And of course, I say frat with a PH for us to join you if we get across the pond. And I would love the opportunity. I'm sure there'll be more of us that have already texted you in the chat. I already put a note there. Please see my email and let's connect, because I would love to next time come to London and see you. So thank you very much for joining us tonight in the wee hours, and appreciate it. All right, Mark.
Thank you. And I work with Coltraco Ultrasonics, we're patron sponsors. At my behest, Coltraco Ultrasonics developed the Portascan Airtight 520, the world's first micro air leak detector. We can detect air leaks as small as 0.06 millimeters in diameter, and we can measure the airflow rate through each leak as small as 0.5 millimeters in diameter, and instantly calculate an overall air permeability rate, a value for any precision-made component or any building. It doesn't have to be in a pressurized environment. We use ultrasound, so panels, windows, doors in a factory can be tested. And during the assembly of a building or during the execution of a build program, you can carry out the air permeability test so that you know that you will pass the passive house air tightness test. You know you will achieve it. No anxiety at all. You know, you can have the absolute certainty that that will be the outcome.
Wow. I don't I can't transition past that, because that was amazing, Bernard. Thank you for being a sponsor. Thank you for being with us. And I mean, as you saw earlier, Bryn has been a first in, honestly, anything Passivos. He has been the first. I know he tried different products before we all knew them. I know that he spent hundreds of thousands of dollars shipping windows from Poland to Vancouver and trying out a new window company. So if you need people to try out here in Vancouver, both him and I would love to connect and work with you. And thank you for joining us so late. Thank you for inspiring with your technology. There's so many other things that I'd love to dive into, but we have to come back to Bryn, because he technically is his show tonight. But I tell you, you almost stole it by looking good and staying up late. Thank you for joining us, and you know, we need to connect, so appreciate you joining us. And boy, you look dazzling this evening, and I do understand that it's for a great cause and to bless an important person in the world's history. And I hope that your community and your friends are grieving well. We're all grieving with you, and thank you for joining us tonight. All right, Bryn. Oh, hard act to follow after that one. Sorry. All right. Going back to the question queue, Edith had a question. And again, I thank Edith for joining us, because Timber HP is working hard to getting some wood fiber manufacturing here in North America. And they've got some products lined up. But Edith, you had a question. I think you did. Or you want to just talk about your cool products you want to produce for us all?
Oh, no, I just first I want to thank Bryn. Thank you so much for all of your work and for accelerating our whole community forward. And I am especially interested in the carbon side of this story, and how you're evolving past just, you know, operational energy. And I guess my question is, do you use LCA data during your design process to influence your material selection? And do you have particular goals to reach net zero when you know, look at the big picture with embodied and operational carbon together?
Yes. Sometimes I say as a building designer that my job is making shit up. And that sometimes goes for the green building stuff too. There is a lot of stuff that we measure very detailed, and there's other places where you're just sort of thinking about things and trying to collaborate with smart people who are actually doing detailed analysis. In the case of carbon, I always say that it's not just embodied or upfront carbon and operational carbon. There's also induced transportation carbon. and then also the legacy carbon from your site. So if you build on a greenfield site, it's very different than if you are renovating or tearing down a fossil fuel powered set of buildings. So when I look at all those 4 areas of carbon together, what we want to try and do is have a building that provides more housing in a walkable location, and uses less operational carbon than what was there before. And if you do all that together, then it does get you to a point where you're actually having a net positive impact. I'd say that in general, the embodied carbon it's kind of a weak point for us. And so it is something that I'm interested in and very much want to see more kind of easy scalable options going forward. I am on the board of an organization called Lighthouse in Vancouver, and they've been doing some interesting life cycle and induced transportation and some of these other things where we're trying to get at a kind of holistic approach to sort of climate analysis. Because that's, that TEDx talk I did in 2014 was pretty much conceptual, and we're still have a little ways to go in terms of getting hard numbers behind that. We have pH ribbon and a lot of other kind of better embodied tools now. So I'm hoping that we have a holistic carbon tool in the next couple of years.
Well, I think that takes care of Edith's question. Thanks for joining us, Edith. Again, appreciate all the hard work you guys are doing at getting us some wood fiber products in North America. Because the biggest thing is like, the manufacturing cost has gone up a little bit, but in the COVID, the container cost is killing all of us, even with the fact that it's, less carbon to still ship it compared to other products here in North America. In the recent years, our good friends of all the different wood fiber manufacturers, the container price has doubled. So $30,000 container of wood fiber now is $50,000, and now it's a luxury boutique item. So we look forward to getting some stuff on some rails and heading north, south, east, and west. So we look forward to that. So appreciate that. And just on point too is, again, if you're not following Bryn on Twitter, I know he will start calculating the carbon footprint of his buildings, because once his son is in bed, all he does is just model and create stuff and put on Twitter. And so I'm sure you'll start modeling carbon now that you have Bream and the pH ribbon and some of the other tools. I know you're just going to dive into it, because what else do you do at 2 a.m. when you're trying to change and move the dials? But again, I do appreciate that the tagline that a lot of us have used from you is the green movement needs to change, and the new green movement is about zoning. And I didn't quite say the right phrase you did, but I know you have that hashtag, and you also have one of the best hashtags in the Passive House, which is thick walls are sexy. So I can't believe it's taken me 90 minutes to recall that amazing hashtag that you have put into the Passive House world or into the building community. So what else? So let me stop questions. I know we got about 3 more before we gotta let you go. What's the latest hashtag that you're brewing on that you could maybe throw out to us before it hits the marketplace?
Oh no, I'm pretty much just on the same ones, basically just saying zoning is the future of green building. Because that's increasingly more and more, I'm not at all that interested about wall assemblies, but more interested about densification and parking requirements and all these other things that impact carbon in really profound ways.
Okay, Mark. So I'm thinking of another thought here. So while I'm going to say this, you put in that line about zoning is the new green, because you're on that point too. Because I know a lot of builders, and I say this to many builders and designers, is especially in Vancouver and everywhere in the world, is that we want to have the thinnest wall, the highest R value, the cheapest cost, and then if we care about the planet, we incorporate the embodied carbon. So that's kind of like the real sweet part of design, because most people that get in a Passive House will not have heard Chris Magwood and just fill it up with maybe products that we should think about, and especially again with the different fossil fuels going in the house. Kind of matters of what those assemblies do. So I'm still into the walls and diving into the walls, and Bryn has now expanded because he's moved away from the knowledge of walls. He knows what the walls he wants to build, and both Mark and I are still heavily into the walls. So all right, segue back to questions. Ian S, if you're still with us, we've got Ian and Jeff, and then I think we're No, and then we got back to Peter. So Ian, if you're not with us, we will go back to Jeffrey, because I see Jeffrey there. So Jeff, why don't you kick off? And I know Ian is still with us, but probably multitasking, which I appreciate. It happens. Jeff, over to you.
So Harvey, being a good friend and not being here, I have to ask his question, but I'm going to.
No, you don't. No.
I am going to modify it. I'm going to modify it slightly because my interest is not so much in what the absolute cost is, but what I'm interested in mostly is how the perceived cost premium of Passive House has changed in your experience from your first project to your current project, because there is this thing called the learning curve, which is experienced by every other industry in the world. And I'm wondering what your experience is in terms of how you've been able to manage the costs based on your learning.
Yeah, I mean, the cost question does come up. I guess the short answer is Vancouver, it's probably 5 to 8% cost premium on hard costs to go to Passive House versus code minimum. Now that's from what? Vancouver's building code is already fairly rigorous compared to many places. And our building costs are also very high compared to many places. So that 8% in Vancouver, if you went to say rural Kansas where they're doing 2x4 at $100 a square foot, it's like 300% cost premium. So it depends on, within your market, but also within the custom home market. A lot of the stuff out there is stupidly expensive for various reasons, like the tile and the size of their, steam shower or whatever. Just so I tell people, Passive House isn't going to be the thing that makes or breaks your budget. But it is the thing that's going to, make your house comfortable and livable and quiet, which are all sort of really tangible things. The type of insulation in your wall, they don't care about too much, but a really nice window, so you're not listening to the noise outside. Those are very tangible things. I say it's, a single family house in Vancouver is already expensive. So if you had a Ferrari and it had like a 1-cylinder engine in it, that's sort of code minimum construction. It's like if you're going to build a nice house, it doesn't take much more effort to really build a nice house, and this is how you do it. And I find those comfort and quiet, those kind of things become quite compelling if you don't have to dwell too much on the sort of incremental cost. And if your city supports you by giving a density bonus, it makes it even easier.
Okay, thank you. I think what I'm thinking about is when I think of Passive House and the cheap benefits of Passive House being health, being comfort, being energy efficiency, being health, comfort, energy efficiency.
There's 12 of them. You got to
noise.
go back to the accelerator.
No, noise reduction. No, those are the 4 real customer-driven, requirements. All of those things go in or speak to the shell. I don't care how much it costs to put in a heated floor, I do, but it's not really the heated floor, the expensive fixture, the really expensive Italian tile that goes into the bathroom that makes really very little difference. I'm just wondering about that core building shell and how much and managing that down. And you talked about it in terms of you have your preferred assemblies pretty much down, and it's driving the cost of those down project to project, which I think is very interesting because that is very transferable to almost any other building project. So when I think about your experience and your learning, it's that part of the project that I'd like to understand more, and I'll be in touch and maybe we could talk about it more, but
So here, let me wrap up the question, Jeff, just a little bit, because he's already been talking for 90 minutes, and that question you just gave us a whole another 90 minutes.
Absolutely.
When you guys are looking at the Passos components, what are, even I can't even summarize it because this is such a long way. I mean, I'm also biased because I've had the opportunity to work with Bryn on that Burnaby house, and I know that Bryn, and again, I mean, Passos in Vancouver is big. Bryn builds the most affordable passive houses in Vancouver. Him and Matt, sorry, I see Matt there. I want to give Matt kudos because he's managing the construction team. They are looking at like the pennies, and they have really refined their work. And I think the fact that they've done a handful now, I mean, I'm sure Bryn, when you include the high performance Laneway homes you've done, you guys have done more than a couple dozen, and they've been able to just tweak and things. So there definitely is no longer, I'd say, the learning curve. I mean, again, I'm speaking for Bryn here, but I'll get him to talk in a second. The learning curve that he has gone through is he's still innovating and still trying new things. But a lot of the big learning curves they've gone through. And I mean, it's funny. Matt was at the Paso tradesperson course, and he was sitting front row, and I was like, so Matt, do you want to come and teach the rest of us the Pasos course? Because you've done more than everyone in this room combined. And he was just trying to get his CPD points and being his credentials. But I was like, you guys have done some amazing work. So anyhow.
All right. So let me I have one last thing. Katrina and Stephen Winters published an article about multifamily building, where the first project had something like a 6 or 8% premium over traditional construction costs. The second building they did was something at like 2% premium, and the third building they did was something like minus 2%. In other words, it was less than traditional. So in other words, there are design problems that you guys have figured out how to make it cheaper than traditional building. And by thinking of it that way, you can basically convince a lot of builders that passive house doesn't have to be more expensive. You can actually, benefit from learning of other people, and it's less risk. So that's kind of where I'm going at. And I'll take this offline. I don't expect an answer. But Bryn and Matt, I hope that I can contact you and we can talk more about this, because this is, I think, a key driver in pushing, passive house level construction out to the masses. Done.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you look at places like in Brussels, where passive equivalent has become the building code, you see this whole shift in the industry, and you go from these very kind of mundane sort of boxy things to actually really interesting, sophisticated architecture. And so you're seeing the evolution of the whole industry within that city kind of happen, and we've been seeing that here as well. There are so many ways that passive house can make your buildings simpler. There's a lot of stupid ways that people spend money on buildings. So I mean, if you can trim out some of those, it's pretty easy to offset that 5 to 8% that you're putting into window upgrades. So yeah, I definitely think that as your industry as a whole within a city comes to scale, and your architects, your engineers, all your consultants get familiar with it, it becomes easier. We also had the ZEBEX, which Zero Emissions Building Exchange. It was 5 or 6 years ago. I was talking to one of the folks of the city, and I said, it's great to have incentives for better insulation, but what we really need to do is support the design teams early on in these projects who are learning how to do passive house and doing all this extra modeling. Because if you look at 5 or 10 grand from a client's point of view at the design stage, they feel that way more than they feel 5 or 10 grand coming out of their construction loan for the massive project. And so early on, when you start looking at, there's going to be an upcharge to do all this extra energy modeling, clients get antsy. So the city came up with an incentive program where they were paying designers and engineers directly for doing passive house projects. And that meant that I could go to a client and say, the first part of this project is cost neutral to you. I'm going to design you a passive house. The design stage doesn't cost anything more. The build stage, you're going to get a nice window that costs a little bit more, but it's like a Ferrari, you know, you're getting something nicer that costs a little bit more. You get the value proposition of that. But the city really supported us through that kind of early learning curve. And I think that was quite important.
Now, that's really fascinating. I'm working on a project right now where we're in Boston, and the mindset of everybody is that we're a heating dominated climate. And the passive house building was a large building. I mean, it was about 90 units. And the heating requirements were about 1/8 of the cooling requirements because of the internal heat, because of the size of the building and the internal heat gains in the number of units and how many refrigerators they had and all that stuff. And so we actually had them move from individualized heating cooling units to a centralized unit on the basis of they could make more money, because the cost of heating a unit was 1/3 of the typical cost of heating, and that they could just say, I'm including heating and cooling in your rent.
Yeah.
And they make more money. The residents think that they're getting a great deal, and actually everybody wins because you get this great passive house building. And so it's that kind of thing that, you know, we need to develop the financial stories around.
Yeah, but
Help
Jeff,
builders get there.
yeah, you've got some great solutions, great examples in Massachusetts with the grants that are coming out, and I know like those funding agencies are working on the integrated design process. And I mean, I work again here in Vancouver. We're lucky with ZebX talked about that, and they put forward grants in the right way. And I know that you have the same opportunities there. I mean, ideally, again, for some of the stuff you're doing, I don't know how often you talk to Bev Craig, but every time she pops on the accelerator, make sure you reach out to her, because there's a lot of good grants that could help out with that learning curve. Because I think we all could say that have done a passive before, is a lot of people lose money on the first one, and then they make it up. And you talk about the 1, 2, 3rd that Lois talks about. I mean, we talk to our friends over in Ireland, and they're on their 10th passive house, and they're like minus 10% because the trades love it, they get it, they see the systematic of how it approaches, and now they're building passive houses for cheaper than code because they've gotten through those hurdles. So we just need more efforts of getting the hurdles, and that's why we do this every week, is to teach people, saying, here's the info, get over it, let's go, let's build it. But also
and to Bryn's point, in Massachusetts, there are a couple cities that have gone to density requirements and basically have, and they're 50%. So like, for instance, in Somerville, Massachusetts, the density is 1,500 square feet per occupant. If you do a net zero or passive house, it's 750 square feet per occupant.
Yeah.
And they have to do it that way because of the way our state laws are structured. We would love to get the entire state there, and I think we're moving there. And Bev Craig is one of the key movers in our state. And yes, love talking to her. She's awesome. And all those things are there, but it's a matter of getting it out, getting the financial message out in a financial framework to the builders. Because in Massachusetts, most developers are financial people, and they hire a construction manager and an architect to do all that building stuff, and they don't care about it. They just assume that they're doing it the right way. But then those people come back and say, well, what are your goals? And their goals are, I want to do it cheaper. And so there's that. It's a circular thing that you have to kind of break into. So the kind of experience, Bryn, that you have, we actually can develop some data that shows that reduction in cost over time. And we can show people that we know if you don't have to start at the beginning like you did. we can take advantage of your experience and start lower. And actually, all we have to do is go down like, you know, how many percent until you hit the minus numbers where we actually can say it's cheaper for you. And they'll be all over that.
Yeah, I'd actually suggest you connect with Cornerstone Architecture, because they are doing a lot of this multifamily passive, and the economics and even things like internal heat gains versus heating, whatever. It's all quite different when you've got 50 units as opposed to 2.
Yeah, very
I'm
much so.
happy to talk about our small scale operation, but our world is very much dominated by the whims of particular owners. So,
Well, no, and mine is too, because the town I live in, I looked at my house.
Yeah.
I cannot, because of zoning, and I live in a very liberal, progressive town, but because of zoning, I can't take my single family house, turn it into 3 units of reasonably sized, you know, multifamily, because the zoning restricts me on it.
Hey,
oh
Jeff,
yeah, don't
just
get me
wait.
started.
Yeah. Well, I was just wait. I mean, it's taken Bryn 12 years to the point where now City of Vancouver's turned all the RS1s into multifamily. So we're
Right.
again.
But I know a bunch of developers in Lexington who are basically saying, "Nah, I don't think I'm into this." And I'm saying, like, well, look, here's this guy, Bryn, who started this 12 years ago, and this is where he is today. What if we can start where he is today and move forward from that?
And this is the whole thing about Lanefab, is that they're, you know, on the leading edge and on a fine line on the bleeding edge. Because I know sometimes that they play around with the innovation
Oh
curve.
yeah,
and
we definitely
dip
spent a
down.
lot of years on the bleeding edge. We're definitely keen to
Yeah, well,
avoid that going forward.
Massachusetts is on the bleeding edge of a lot of things.
You know,
in this
well,
area, so-
we all are, and that's why we show up every Wednesday. So, hey, you
Absolutely.
know what's not great too is, you know, we're lucky when, you know, not only does we have incentives from the city, but when you have city inspectors and the manager of city inspectors hang out on the accelerator, 118 minutes into things. So, Leighton, thank you for being involved in the city of Vancouver, and I appreciate connecting with the inspectors. That if they don't know passives, I'm like, well, you got to talk to Leighton because he's on
Oh
board. with
yeah,
what
it's
we're doing.
it's absolutely critical. Otherwise, if your project gets hung up for a month, you know, trying to fight through an inspection issue, you can, you know, worry about assemblies and costs, but you need to have the whole team on board.
Leighton, I cheers to you, my friend.
Bryn,
You
I
know-
hope we can talk.
Yeah.
I'll be the
Happy
first
to,
one
happy
to
to,
say
yeah.
that your inspector is better than my inspector.
Oh, I know he is. Oh, I know he is. So, okay. Sorry. We got one last question. Sorry, Bryn, I was going to let you go, but Ian actually had a good one, and we still have a few more people. Kim, I can't believe she highlighted this question for me. On the shading of trees, how accurate do you find you have to get the trees, given a limb may come down, by finding in my modeling? It takes a huge difference. I won't be able to ask the question. So just wondering about, you know, when you're looking at some of the shading issues, how do you deal with modeling of trees? And I only know that you might know this question because you dive into the details. So
Yeah, this is one of
last
the
one.
interesting things, because like if we do net zero, we don't even think about it. But with passive house, it is important. Ultimately, it comes down to what your certifier wants to see. But I would say that in design pH, what we do is we have a 3D model of a tree that has leaves that you can turn on and off. And we turn it on and we run the shading, and we get a certain coefficient that we use in the summer, and then we turn them off and we run it and we put those numbers in for the winter. And it's just sort of a workaround that gets you close enough that the certifier is like, okay.
So again, Mark, we talked about earlier, Bryn could come on and talk about just the details of the canopy and that detail. Then we'll just talk about second half. We'll just talk about how he deals with shading of trees. I mean, Ian says thank you. Appreciates that. Okay, David, you know what? I did forget your question only because it's on the second page of the question list. Do you want to ask it, or are you happy to just call it a night? It's up to you.
Okay, thanks. Brent, thank you very much. Yeah, I would like to ask it because I know you're heading that way. I could tell from your voice. On the planning, if you had the top 3 things, if you could design green space like an infill, for regardless of what the existing zoning is, what are the top 3 things you'd implement?
3 to 8 story multifamily zoning across the board. Ideally with a point access block with about 50% site coverage and no underground parking. I would love to see bicycle parking floor area exclusions so that we can have e-bikes with a similar level of amenity to what we only provide for cars. I think it's important that we have improved accessibility. So that means at-grade construction and elevators where we can, as opposed to the way we've typically done things. And then looking at the low embodied materials and having some kind of system to offset the sort of perverse economics that make the fossil fuel stuff really cheap still.
Well,
Thank
there
you.
you have it, David. And if you're not following Bryn on Twitter, you would have seen that is probably the one tweet I've seen of him. It was about tenfold. He maxed out every 250 words you're allowed to do in Twitter to make sure he just said exactly what he just said in Twitter. So you got it on the accelerator, and we typically don't, like what happens in the overtime doesn't get carried away. So at the almost 120-minute mark of the evening, you got the gold standard of the evening. So only an exclusive few only got to hear those things, David. So take it and run, do what you need to do with it. And if not, hire Bryn and Matt and, get them over in Toronto and doing some cool stuff. So.
Love to. Thank you very much.
All right, Bryn, we've exhausted you. We've stole you for more time than we should have. And of course, anytime that I see you, I will pay for all of your root beers because I appreciate all that you and Matt do. So on that point, Kim is ready to hit the eject button. And so folks, call it a night. You got lots of homework. You got to see Bryn's TED Talk, get him over 184,000 views, which is pretty amazing. We have tomorrow, if you're hanging out with the Passos Canada Prefab Symposium, we're in day 2. Might see Mr. Mark Wiley doing a presentation. I have no idea what he will present on. I have not helped him out with his presentation. I have not inserted photos and videos into his presentation. I have not done any of that. Only a good friend would do such work. And then if you want to hang out with Dave and Mark on Friday, they're going to have Lloyd Alter talking about whatever Lloyd does, because Lloyd is, again, as you talk about Bryn being a movement, Lloyd's a movement, and we're grateful for all that stuff done. So Bryn, always can't thank you enough. And I know Matt's doing his little barely sees eyeballs in his in his view there. Matt, appreciate what you do. Bryn, keep fighting the good fight. And as you can see from tonight, there's a lot of people that appreciate you and can't thank you enough for being on the leading edge and just on the hair above the bleeding edge.
Just a hair above. That's the sweet spot. Thanks all.
Appreciate it. Cheers.